All right, my friends, we're going to get started. Here we go. Okay. So there exists a popular perception that Soviet leadership banned dissemination of photojournalistic presentation of Nazi atrocities. Not only are those claims false, but in reality, it was the Soviets who were the first to produce such records. We also need to note in such that a lot of Jews were among the Soviet Jewish photographers of the war. A lot of Jews. They played a major role in the process. With the onset of Germany's invasion into Poland, the party and the Soviet propaganda machine took a more direct role in shaping all of the messages that were sent out to the Soviet people. And as a result, they opened the Russian archives in 1996 and they found the following. It said, the main tasks of the press in the battle must be to develop heroism, bravery, military arts, and selflessly carrying out the commander's orders. Those were the overarching premises of all pictures to be taken, of all press releases to be provided. During the war, the line that divided the civilian and the military newspapers was blurred. Information became essential for all, and as a result, the hot publication to work for was the Army's leading newspaper, the Red Star. It paid good salaries. They recruited some of the top photographers and writers in the country, many of whom, as I said, were Jewish. This was a time when you're at war, when economic resources are very limited. And nonetheless, significant resources were dedicated to shape the kind of information that was trickling down to the readers, to the population at large. The party also strongly believed in creating these smaller newspapers that were geared towards a diverse audience so that everyone could have access. And during the war, that meant creating special newspapers for those at the front, many of whom were many different demographics. And so there were dozens of languages, including Yiddish, which reflected the ethnic diversity of the Soviet army. The war with Nazi Germany and its allies would sort of be a new experience, a new challenge for Soviet photojournalists. They were accustomed to being told that they needed to produce photos that would elevate the everyday worker, that would beautify labor, that would glorify Stalin and the Soviet state. In war, or in all situations, print journalists could use telephones, they could read reports, they could interview people to write a story, all from the safety of the rear. Photographers, however, who are charged with documenting battles, are obligated to be at the scene and therefore in potential danger. They were used to traveling in the 1930s, but they traveled more than ever and under conditions in which they had never experienced. Many of them were killed in the process of the war. Additionally, to be noted, the conditions, because things were so limited economically, during this time, film, chemicals, and cameras were desperately in short supply, and the result was that the photographer had to make every shot count. It's not like walking up with your phone and taking 500 pictures and figuring out which one works for me. Right? It's a different world completely today. They had limited supplies. Every picture had to count. The summer of 41, after the invasion of Germany, doesn't go well for the Soviet army. The German Wehrmacht pushes deeper and deeper and deeper into Russian territory. And every newspaper, as a result, is shifting its focus. It's dedicating the opening pages. What does the Russian leadership want you to see? It wants you to see Soviet heroes. Their goal was to portray. Anyway, all right. So the Soviet Union had been collecting pictures and keeping archival images of Nazi atrocities for years, even during the period in which they had a pact with Nazi Germany. They had a history because they too had been through war. They had been through civil war. They had been through World War I. They had already had a process in place of keeping track of any kinds of atrocities, and so they kept them already, even prior to the Nazi invasion. In 1939, again, before the invasion, Pravda published a series of Japanese atrocity photographs that were like the Nazi images. They were trophy photos taken by the Japanese themselves. And so as a result, the Soviet reading audience had already been exposed to these kinds of atrocities and had been somewhat made numb to them. Throughout 1941, once the invasion began, nearly all of the photographs in this early period of Nazi atrocities were taken by photographers working for the Germans or by the German soldiers themselves. Not infrequently, when a German soldier was killed in battle, the Soviet troops would find the body, retrieve the camera, and document the atrocities. It sounds an awful lot like October 7th. Okay. January 1942, 7 months after the invasion of the Soviet Union, a photographer by the name of Dmitry Baltermans flew over the Black Sea into the region of the newly liberated city of Kerch. In other words, Kerch had been conquered by the Germans, and now it's been liberated. And this is one of the first areas with a significant pre-war Jewish population that is liberated from Nazi occupation, which means it's one of the first places, Kerch is, where Soviet soldiers, journalists, and photographers saw with their own eyes the effect of Nazi occupation in the war against European Jewry. The clothing on the corpse, and you have the first picture in the handout that I gave you. The first picture, the clothing on the corpses suggests that these were civilians brought out to this field and shot in mass. Now, retrospectively, we know about all this, but you can imagine as it's being discovered for the first time, it's being discovered by the Russians as they reconquer Kerch. Baltermans and the other photojournalists who were assigned to Kerch became the first liberators to photograph the mass murder of Jews by the Einsatzgruppen on Soviet soil. What's that? Okay. Baltermans knew, I keep wanting to say Baltermans knew that he was not just taking films for tomorrow's newspaper. Rather, what he was doing was bearing witness to something important. And as a result, despite the fact that film was so precious, he used 2 rolls of film to photograph the scene before him. The caption below the photograph suggests how the editors placed these photographs into an evolving narrative of the war and the Nazi atrocities. The caption said, Hitler ordered his bandits to annihilate the peaceful Soviet population. Now, if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, that's a code word for Jews, peaceful Soviet population. Wherever the Germans found themselves, they murdered thousands of women and children. This is skewering the perpetrators of the crime, but in one sense, it's followers of Hitler, and in another, it's German, and that will play out later. That's an important distinction. No mention, however, is made that the dead women, the dead children, the dead people in the photographs were Jewish. At best, there's this code word that is used. In the accompanying story, there are hints at the Jewishness when they say something to the effect of one particular ethnicity. That's as close as they got. They universalized the Nazi atrocities. Soviet editors rarely labeled them as Jews or Jews as targets. All right. Most people did understand the reality of what was going on, and they understood it was Jews, but the paper was trying to shape this image of a universal experience, not targeting any particular group, particularly the Jews. The first time we see any evidence to the contrary is in late November 1941, during the massacre of Kiev's Jewish community at Babi Yar. The report says that in Kiev, the Germans executed 52,000 Jews, men, women, and children. This is the first mention of Jews in reality and probably one of the only ones. The reason for this is multifold. One, they're trying to portray everyone as being Soviet citizens. The other is they're running the risk, if they label them as Jews, of having the general readership not see themselves in the photographs. This is about ratings, right? When we read the newspaper, one of the first things we do is look for, is that my group or is that not my group? And if it's not my group, I'm less likely to read through the story. I'm less likely to see myself in the story. They were aware of this. Immediately after the city's liberation, Kerch administrators put up posters giving graphic evidence of what the Nazis had done, just in case it wasn't obvious. And you can see a picture of one here. It says, residents of Kerch examined TASS windows 1942. And they were intended to shock, as well as to encourage the viewers to fight harder to prevent the Germans from reacquiring the city. Right? Just because you reconquered it doesn't mean you have a permanent ownership. And they're trying to inspire people to put up a bigger fight. This experience of Kerch became the symbolic reference point for Nazi atrocities, the place at which Soviet witnesses saw with their own eyes that the rumors, the innuendos, and even the published trophy photographs were actually true. Kerch became, remember the Alamo. In 1943, in his book written in 1943, Russia at War, Ehrenberg, a Soviet journalist and a well-known wartime Soviet writer, wrote about the German atrocities at Kerch, and that's reading number 1. Sandy, you have the first box.
The Germans came to Russia drunk with the blood of Poles, Frenchmen, and I guess it meant Serbs, with the blood of old people, girls, and infants in arms, and death came with them to our country. I do not mean the death of soldiers, for no war is without its victims. I refer to the gallows from which the bodies of Russian girls are dangling, and the terrible pit near Kerch in which the children of Russians, Tatars, and Jews are buried. The memory of what we have experienced cannot be wiped out.
Right. This is not normal warfare. Conditions for the journalists were also terrible. In a letter dated September 1942, called a complaint to his editor, and Diane or Manny, you have reading number 2.
Okay. It has become much more difficult to work now, especially when trying to sleep at night in the trenches on the front line. We have no clothing against the cold.
All right, they're worried about. Hold on, let me let a couple people in. I'm trying to figure out how to do this. There's people in the waiting room. How do I let them in view? Here we go. Admit. Okay, there we go. Okay. Where do we go? There we go. Nope, not again. There we go. All right. They worried about money. They worried about how they've taken pictures. How are they going to get the film back to Moscow? This is not something you send on the internet. They worried about whether they would survive the war at all. The conditions were horrendous. By the summer of 42, the newspapers and magazines were calling for vengeance against an enemy that had no rules, no sense of rules of engagement. The press introduced new concepts of memory and vengeance in headlines that were intended to terrorize the population and to rile up its anger. And so you have images of tanks becoming very popular throughout the war. There were pictures of soldiers, but oftentimes the pictures of soldiers were not close enough to show faces because they wanted the Soviet military everyman to be the image people walked away with. That's me. That could be me. In March 1943, the TASS photojournalists received instructions which were valid for 3 months, telling them to take pictures of, reading number 3, Diane.
The support given to families of soldiers on the front, help given to the peoples of recently liberated areas, general military training, deputies of the Supreme Soviet, as well as the best producers in factories, on collective farms, etc. Food and other gifts given to soldiers on the front in honor of May 1st. Hospitals and the care of the injured, care for permanently injured veterans, visits by famous people to the front.
Okay, so what has happened here is the Soviet army has begun to be much more successful in recapturing and repelling the invasion. And so this is meant to be reflected in photography, and they've changed the image. There were needs for pictures of liberation, reestablishment of factories, other signs of life, as opposed to the constant reminder of the Nazi death machine. So with the changing fortunes is a very deliberate effort to shape what is being seen. The battles for Budapest and Warsaw began in the fall of 1944, a year later, and would last into January 45. The liberation of Warsaw came on January 17th, Budapest on January 20th, and these defeats signaled the near total collapse of the German occupation of Europe. And as a result, for the first time, you have Russians standing on European soil that the Soviet Union had never held in its possession. They've gone beyond their previous borders. The archival record of the liberation of Budapest shows just how destructive the battle was for this key city. Kaldea, again, one of the photographers, a Jewish photographer, produced dozens of photographs of the horrific destruction. It's collapsed bridges, it's bombed out buildings, it's dead and wounded. It's kind of like if you see the images of Gaza today. That's what they were photographing. The published record, what actually made it to the newspapers, was a much more sanitized vision of the war and liberation. The images deliberately mask an ambivalence for a particular reason. The Soviet troops, as they moved in, were brutal. They were vengeful. It says, according to Julius Hayes, a communist intellectual, he wrote, it was impossible to spend a day or even an hour in Budapest without hearing of brutalities committed by Russian soldiers. Vengeance became one of the dominant features of the Red Army's occupation in Germany, with rampant murder, rape, and pillaging. Warsaw suffered a particularly brutal fate as well. It's one of the first major cities occupied by the Germans, Warsaw is, in 1939, and it's one of the last cities liberated. So it was under German control for more time than virtually any other area. And given the fact that it had a large Jewish population, most of whom were nearly murdered. And so the photography, however, again, is there shaping it. The photography focuses on physical destruction of landscapes, the toppling of symbolic statues. The reader is not faced with bodies that had littered the images of liberation earlier. The message had changed. Additionally, as the Red Army approaches Germany and the end of the war is nearing, the Soviet press shifts some of its attention away from the violence against people, and a distinction is now being made, very important, between German and Hitlerite. In April 1945, as a matter of fact, a journalist is reprimanded on the pages of the Soviet press for his anti-German diatribes in which he fails to differentiate between good and bad Germans. The press was ordered to show this differentiation, to show a shift in language from Germans to Hitlerites and fascists. suggesting that the enemy was not a national problem, it was an ideological problem. Germans no longer needed to be painted as evil. Now, the reality of it is, if you understand, they're taking over large parts of Germany and they know it's going to be under their control, you can understand the motivation for doing this. They have to control these people once it's all happened. To continue to portray them as evil makes it more difficult. Calde's most important photograph of the war, and really of his entire career, was that of the raising of the red flag over the Reichstag. Much has been written about it because it's modeled after the same, a similar photo by Joe Rosenthal's Iwo Jima. And you can see in the pictures the two flags being raised. The very famous picture for Iwo Jima and the parallel picture by the Russians. That's the message they're trying to convey. With certain any comments or questions before I go into the prosecution piece of what happened? Okay. Although Russia participated as a full member of the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which ultimately led to the Nuremberg trials, it nonetheless had its own approach as well to Nazi war crimes. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the government enacted martial law, which was described as the avenging sword of social justice, and tools of revenge began to show up. Their experience, remember, this is a people that is experienced at war. They've just been through Civil War. They've just been through World War I. They understood the importance of tracking everything that was going on. They investigated crimes in every city liberated by the Red Army. Although it's argued that the primary purpose for all of this was not about discovering the truth, but to deflect attention from the Soviet Union's own war crimes. They wanted to make sure that the Russian behaviors were not discovered. You needed to deflect. It's how we work in our society as well. In most liberated cities, nonetheless, the investigators found these ravines or trenches on the outskirts of town where the mass murders took place with the victims were haphazardly buried. This we know. This is not new, but for them, this is new. The first major war trial of World War II took place in 1943, July, in the southern city of Krasnodar, and is covered extensively by the Jewish press. It's filled with descriptions of mass shootings, of vans of people, dozens of people locked inside, which at the time they didn't understand what was going on, and of other atrocities associated with occupying forces. I'm exhausted. You end up with what essentially is a new genre of photography, of the Nazi atrocity photo, which generally includes a ravine, a ditch, a field or a pit, women and children. And you have a picture of this by Trockman, and it was underlined saying, Poles watching Germans bearing witness to corpses, August 1944. Mm-hmm. What you see here as well in the stories, as well as the captions that underline these pictures, is this, it's given, there's almost a seemingly detached tone to the way things are described. These people, because of all the war they'd been through, it's like they become like forensic researchers. They become numb to this already. It didn't strike them the way it would you or me. In one report describing a vast ravine, tunnels filled with bodies, we read reading number 4. Bob, do you have this? Okay, Leslie, do you have it? Just unmute.
Oh,
all right, there you go. There you go.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the particularly good local conditions, exceptionally dry air, low and consistent temperature, porous ground of the caves, many of the bodies were mummified and many of them were exceptionally well preserved. The clothing on all bodies was winter wear, heavy coats and other outerwear. Heads and ears were covered. Most of the bodies were marked with white bands on the left arm of the coat with stars of David sewn on or drawn on. On several of the bodies, there was bright, colorful clothing, such as is normally worn by gypsies.
There's no words like horrific. There's no words like terrible. There's no adjectives that describe this in the way one would assume. This is the report of somebody who's been numbed by terrible events prior. In January of 43, as they pushed west, the Russian army, and liberated every town and village, they discovered new depths of atrocities, of Nazi atrocities. It got only more and more gruesome as they moved west because the Jewish population of the Ukraine increased the further west one went. This was terribly traumatic for the Jewish writers in particular. Not only were they aware of the targeting of Jews, but they were writing or photographing about the towns of their childhood, places that they had moved to Moscow for career purposes. As early as the fall of 1941, Kaldei wrote in his diary about what he knew was going to be the impending tragedy of his hometown of Salino. Marcia, would you read reading number 5?
Our forces continue to retreat to new positions from Bialystok, Kaunas, Lvov, Kiev, Dnepropetrovsk, Mariupol, Odessa, and Nikolaev.
Well done.
Battle is raging in the area of Mykolaievsk, just 12 kilometers from Stalino, where my father, sister, and my relatives are. Where are they and why are they silent? Did they flee? I just do not know. A few days later, the announcer modestly and quietly announced that our troops had abandoned Stalino. I just cannot calm down. It's impossible for me to imagine the Germans are roaming the streets of my hometown, Stalino.
So just a year before he wrote this, he had gone back and visited Stalino. He saw the cemetery. His mother had died not because of the war. She had just died. So he visited the cemetery. A year later, after he's written this, because he's talking in the later article, he's talking about what he anticipates finding. When he does go back, he describes the visit as a major trauma. Most of his family had been killed in the ravine near the town. And in a later interview, he changed the way he describes the change in the way he sees his role as a photojournalist. His camera has become not only one of documentation, but a tool of revenge. 1943. I'm just going to keep going. Photographs appear for the first time of a small Nazi camp for Soviet war prisoners of war. The photographs of barracks, bones, and graffiti suggest that something new to the reader. The presence of a camp suggests for the first time that the Nazis established permanent sites in which to commit their atrocities, not just ravines on the outskirts of town. On July 3rd, 1944, on the outskirts of Minsk, this is the first one, 1944, the Russians discovered the existence of Maly Trostenets. How many of you have heard of this camp? Maly Trostenets. Right, the reason I say that, it's a small concentration camp, but it's a concentration camp in which 65,000 Jews are killed. That's more than the Jewish population in Houston. It's as if every Jew in the entire city plus another 20,000 are killed, and it's not even in our dictionary of words, it's inconsequential. There's a picture there of the charred remains of the Jewish victims at that site, and it's from the Holocaust Museum archives. This is not clearly not on the scale of the 6 extermination camps in Poland. Nonetheless, it functioned as a concentration death camp for Jews in the Minsk area and for those transported to the region from other parts of Europe. But it really serves as a prelude to the first major camp, the discovery of Majdanek 3 weeks later. Majdanek becoming the first major camp gets the most marketing, the most publicity of any of the camps when they're discovered, because it's first. In the 1970s, a Soviet commander at Stalingrad and later the commander of the Third Ukrainian Front describes his response to seeing this at Majdanek. All right, and that's reading number 6. I think, Lou, you've got this one.
A death camp. No, not a camp. A death factory outfitted with the latest equipment for mass murder in a fiendishly organized way. I am omitting the details of horrifying procedure, for these are described in many documentary accounts. But I must confess that after I heard the full story and saw photographs taken by our officers, I refused to go there. I just could not. Millions of human beings brutally murdered and burned in furnaces. Millions. Men, women, children. No one was spared. The Nazis hitched inmates on hooks, clubbed them to death, poisoned them with gas.
Okay. Now, again, this unfortunately, we know this retrospectively. This is really the first they're encountering. This is the first the world is encountering this. They know of the shootings. They know of the ravines. They're not aware of this, or nobody had, even if they were, nobody had seen it prior. Heinrich Himmler had designated Majdanek as a camp of Soviet prisoners of war soon after they overthrew the Russian defenses in 1941. 3 years later, however, by 1944, the complex within view of the city of Lublin, it's visible, had expanded to accommodate new functions, including a large-scale processing of stolen property, most of it from murdered Jews, as well as the extermination by gas and shooting of Jews, Russian soldiers, and Poles. At any one time, there were basically between 25 and 40,000 prisoners within its electrified barbed-wired fences. But compared to the other extermination camps, Majdanek was the most universal. It was the least Jewish. It doesn't mean there wasn't tens and hundreds of thousands of Jews, but by comparison, it paled to the others, and it was far more universalistic. Soviets had never seen anything like Majdanek before. In the few days after its liberation, members of the Extraordinary Commission for Documenting Crimes Bearing Witness to Atrocities began collecting materials, propaganda materials for post-war. Viewers were introduced to things they had never seen before. A bizarre photograph of canisters. They had no idea what it was. And so in order to understand what the canister was, one had to read the article next to it to realize this is a gas canister. They had no clue. All right. The images of fields of shoes became a very important disembodied image representing Majdanek, the absence of thousands of people who once stood in those thousands of pairs of shoes. And you've got the picture there again from the Holocaust Museum archives. Yes, Leslie.
If I could just share one thing that relates to the shoes. Umpteen years ago, we went on a trip with Rabbi Asadji from the shul. And
Right.
They were doing the opening of Yad Vashem's children's museum. And when you first walked in, there was a glass enclosed little shoe of a child. And then you go in and it's all dark, and then there are mirrors with a candle, and the names of the children are all read. 1.5 million.
Right.
Fast forward, we went on a Federation trip a few years later, and then we go back to Yad Vashem, and they have more things for you to see, but we wanted to go back to the Children's Museum. And I looked, and there was no single shoe in a box. And why was that? I went up to one of the guards. He said they had to remove it because Holocaust survivors, when they saw it, it was too much for them.
Yeah, it's fully understandable. If you went to the Dallas Holocaust Museum years ago, as you entered, you had to walk through what was a car from a train
Mhm.
that had been used in the Holocaust. That was the entryway.
Mm,
They've subsequently removed it.
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they had that at the United States Holocaust Museum, the elevator you went in,
Right.
the light bulb. Yeah,
But you could opt out and go another way. That was the key.
yeah.
Yeah. Majdanek, in terms of the perception that they wanted to portray, was so not Jewish that the photographs of the funeral processions for the victim, with crowds lining the streets and rows of coffins being led to the burial ground, reveal that it's not following a Soviet star. It's led by crosses.
Mm.
Mm.
They were conveying a non-Jewish message. When the BBC, the British media, receives a detailed report about Majdanek in August of 1944, they refused to use it, thinking that it was a Russian propaganda stunt. And it isn't until the discovery in the west of Buchenwald and Dachau and Belsen that they were convinced that Majdanek was genuine.
Mm.
It was beyond belief. The New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune said of the Majdanek story, maybe we should wait for further corroboration of the horror story that comes from Lublin. Even on top of all that we have been taught about the maniacal Nazi ruthlessness, this example seems inconceivable. The LA Times warned its readers that the material it was publishing might just be propaganda.
Mm.
It's beyond comprehension. And there's on top of that, there's a clear distrust on the part of the British and the American press for the Soviet press, as we often have even today. You're not sure what to trust, what is being shaped and inaccurate. And so, but nonetheless, nearly all of those responsible for creating the story of Majdanek as we see it were professional photographers, professional writers, professional filmmakers, many of them assimilated Soviet Jews who end up telling what is a very universalistic story of atrocity and tragedy. Why the universalism by the Jews? Couple reasons. One, the one most commonly assumed is that a directive from the Central Committee told the journalists, filmmakers, and others to tone down the Jewishness of the war. No such document has ever been found. No directive of that nature has been found. Rather, what seems to have happened was by editors in editing out of the word Jew, in editing out of the Jewishness from both public and internal sources of the Nazi atrocities. Second, that's one reason. Second, like some of their American counterparts, some Soviet Jews might have wanted to consider Nazi atrocities against Jews as a universal problem. They wanted to see themselves as a part of the larger Soviet Union, not a part of this smaller group of Jews as we understand ourselves within society. And so, what you always have to be aware of in any of these kinds of situations is that there's a range of reactions. You can't ask what's the Jewish response. You can't ask what is the Black response. There's multiple responses. Nobody fits into a hat. And so that's what you see as well in these stories. Even among the Jews, they have different motivations for producing what is being produced. Treblinka is found on August 23rd, 24, a couple of weeks later. This is when the foreign journalists are first discovering Majdanek. So the Soviets find Treblinka, And the Treblinka report opens with the phrase, this is from the report, the extermination camp in Treblinka in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered. It's the clearest articulation of Jews, unlike Majdanek. As with the Majdanek report, which minimalized this, this is not the report, but the official Treblinka report, the one that was published and publicized, said that when Treblinka was a labor camp in 1944, there were, quote, in addition to Poles, Jews, Gypsies, Czechs, and others. Now, I said to you before, Majdanek being the first got the most coverage. It overshadowed the coverage that Treblinka got as a news story. The few photographs of Treblinka in the Yad Vashem archives in Jerusalem basically show what you would think of as a lunar scene. There's a picture there in there. It says Treblinka Yad Vashem archives. It is devoid of barracks and gas chambers and other remains of the mass killings. All right. Majdanek had all of those things. Treblinka looks like nothing ever existed. When I was in the Canary Islands, I went to an island that was volcanic, and I walked out. It looked like this. It had that same sense of nothingness. You're nowhere. Nothing ever existed here, and that's what the pictures of Treblinka are communicating. Auschwitz is liberated by the Red Army later than the other 5 extermination camps in Poland. It's not liberated until January 27, 1945. Its liberation by this point as the last gets very little news. All right. Nonetheless, the word Auschwitz has come to mean the Holocaust. In 2005, the date of January 27th, when it was liberated, has become the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. There was a brief report in the Soviet press about Auschwitz. On February 2nd, 1945, Pravda published a short report about it that didn't mention Jews. The New York Times published a 100-word story of the Russian coverage, same kind of distancing from Russian reporting, not sure how much of this is accurate. Times were different in the Soviet Union. The politics of the Nazi atrocities had shifted. With Soviet soldiers nearing the German border, you now have a less hate-driven campaign. And by the fall of 1944, Nazi atrocities, are taking a back seat to the rebuilding of the Soviet society. Open to comments or questions or thoughts. Yes, Leslie.
I thought in terms of publicizing what soldiers had seen in the concentration camps, I thought there was a story of Eisenhower coming in with troops, saw what was being done, and he insisted that photographs be taken everywhere, and that he rounded up the townspeople to come in and help clear things out, because the townspeople said, oh, we didn't know anything about that.
Yeah, actually, he wanted the townspeople to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to basically rub their noses in it so they couldn't deny it. And his words were, I want this photographed because someday some son of a bitch is going to say it didn't happen.
Ah.
Yeah, no, you're 100% correct. But understand, it's the Red Army that first encounters Auschwitz and that first reports on it, and the American press is not willing to grab onto it until an Eisenhower arrives.
Hmm.
And then the reports become far more believable because they're through our lens and through our eyes, and we don't perceive them as propaganda per se. Anybody else? Yes, Lou.
I read a book few months ago called The Escape Artist by a guy named Jonathan Friedland that discusses a man who escaped from Auschwitz in April 1944. The guy's name originally was Walter Rosenberg. He was from Slovakia. He and another guy managed to escape and make their way back to Slovakia and to Hungary. They documented as best as they could information to, this was before most of the Jews were exported from Budapest to Auschwitz. But the community sat on it, and the Jewish community sat on it, and so did the British. It's an amazing book, and this was before Majdanek was liberated. So there was information, but it didn't make it out, and all kinds of various explanations as to why the Jewish community leadership in Budapest sat on it, including the Catholic Church and as I mentioned, the British.
Right. So, look, again, it had a hard time getting out, and when it did get out, nobody believed it. So next time, one of the things I'm going to do we're going to do one more session on the Holocaust, again through the lens of photographers. But as part of that, I'm going to do a look at, I'm going to step aside from the major part of this course to some extent. How did the average German just sit by and watch? Okay. And I want to talk about that, and I have a book that I'll use as a resource. In the meantime, I've read this book called Ordinary Men a number of years ago, which talks about the war by bullets. In other words, the ravine and all the shootings, and the experience of the German soldiers reported here by Christopher Browning, who's not Jewish. I happened to have seen on Netflix. There is a documentary called Ordinary Men, in which Christopher Browning presents on this, and it's not very long. It is a worthwhile read to see this, that ordinary people were put into, Germans were put into very weird situations, and why would they indeed shoot Jews? Why would the average person? A lot of the people he describes in this battalion were from Hamburg. They had been TV anchors. They had been newspapermen. They had been the local street cleaners and bus drivers, etc. How is it they end up doing this? It's a very good look. So it's a documentary on Netflix called Ordinary Men, or you could just read the book. Yes, Leslie.
They interviewed the Righteous Gentiles, wrote a book about it, and there was a museum. I don't think it's in Dallas, but I remember going there. And if you could just focus in on one aspect, why did these righteous Gentiles take in Jews and their families and protect them? Because if they were found out, their families would die. And across the board, they said because it was the right thing to do.
Right. So, and I get that, and I try, as much as I appreciate these are heroic efforts, I try very hard not to spend too much time on it. The reason being, it portrays the outlier, the very few exceptions to what the majority behavior was. We like the hero story, but sometimes the hero story overshadows the reality of what was.
Okay.
And so yes, learn about it, but try not to. It's it's like saying this. Here's the one example of somebody who broke the pattern, and that proves the exception proves the rule.
No, I don't think it does.
Well, but that's the phrase as it goes. In other words, they were the outliers. If 98% of the people are doing one thing and 2% of doing the other, I don't want to spend too much time on that 2% because they didn't represent very many people. A couple 100,000 in the middle of hundreds of millions. All right. So yes, study about it, learn about it, but don't assume it is in any way a picture of what the population was like. It is not. We want a feel-good story. I know that. All right, my friends, I hate being the bearer of such negative stories. We will get through this in another week, and then we will go to the post-Holocaust period in Soviet. Not next week. 2 weeks. Next week, the staff is actually going to do a community service project. We're going to go out and make a difference in the world.
Ah, wonderful.
All right, everybody, a good week. Stay warm. I hope in California you're warmer than we are.
Not
Oh.
much.